Hi, my name is Hans Schaus, and I'm recording for Module 6 video presentation assignment. What I'm going to go over is each question, and with each question, discuss the material that I read and how it applied to the simulation, what I gathered from it, and sort of my experiences through the simulation and how the reading helped me enhance my experience through the simulation. So the first question is, how did these resources enhance your knowledge of project management? So the first resource we read was PMI's Pulse of the Profession, the High Cost of Low Performance. And that was a very high-level view for me on the importance of project management from an organizational standpoint. It gave a lot of details on comparing and contrasting high functional organizations that had a high emphasis on project management standardization versus those that didn't, and the cost that a company would endure if they were not set up with project management being a focal point of their initiations, or their change initiatives rather. So that for me was the pulse of that resource. It was good. It helped me reflect on my own organization that I work for and where they are at, and I think we're sort of in that storming phase of still trying to figure out how project management intertwines, but specifically with our IT department and how that can expand abroad and create a larger portfolio for the organization as a whole. So it was good to read from that standpoint and compare and contrast from that standpoint. The other resource was Preventing Scope and Scheduled Risks. I absolutely loved reading that entire chapter of just breaking down the role of a PM and what our responsibilities are to the organization, to the stakeholders, to the sponsor, and what our key tasks are in functioning as an effective PM. So I won't go into too much detail on this particular question. I'll dive a little bit more deeper into that. And then lastly was the blog entry is easy in theory, difficult in practice, and that had to deal with the contingency reserves that PMs could access and the percentage of those PMs that felt it was a requirement for them to receive the reserves without asking, essentially, or the opposite effect of how many PMs who rightly should have access to the contingency reserve still need to ask for approval, and should it now just become standard practice that it still needs approval. Traditionally, it seems that PMs have access to the contingency reserve without asking. It's only until we get into the management reserve that larger authorization or authorization to begin with is needed. So the next question, why do you agree with all of their assertions? If not, why not? So the pulse of the profession, the high cost of low performance, where I agree with the overall theme, and again, I have a really good example to compare it to my company, is they're starting to see. So in the past couple of years, my company has implemented PMs and BAs. They've actually combined the role. And one legitimate PM that has a degree, a master's degree, and has her PMP cert, told me she is a PM plus. So it's mainly because they don't have enough resources to assist with project tasks. So, she's a PM, but she's also doing a lot of the tasks to assist with the project. And she has been such a key player in a lot of our large IT development projects in the past couple of years. They are now hiring more PMs. I fortunately was able to be hired as one. I have a lot of experience in the industry. I'm a, I'm a very educated SME, I feel like, and I'm learning PM and BA as I go. And so reading again through this resource, it just highlighted the target in which I think our company is going towards. I think there is a lot of standardization that we have to work on. I can tell you right now, there is not any across PMs except what website source we're supposed to use to keep our GANs and our risks and our issues. So in some way it's standardized, but it's not as standardized as it needs to be. And it's not, it's also, it's just so brand new that it's really hard to critique it, because I think they want to go towards standardizing what was the three major key factors of high performing organizations, focusing on talent management. They're doing that across the board, driving strategic alignment in the way they're managing IT projects for right now, and I think that could go abroad. And then supporting standardized PM, which I think they're starting to do as well. So I think reading this resource and comparing it to my own company, it was good to see sort of where we're at in that progression. So going back to the question, so I remember exactly. Preventing scope and scheduled risk. There's nothing to agree with. It's the realities of project management, and part of the reason why I love it so much is because it is a systematic approach of completing something. I had a job where it was very undefined in a process improvement role, and it was hard to gather who I needed to support from, which way I could go, and which way, and if it was approved, and by who it needed to be approved. It just was so undefined, it's even hard to describe it. Project management is enticing to me because there's a goal, there's deliverables, there's requirements of those deliverables, and those main points were huge for me. I actually wrote down that one key point was simply stated, well-defined, agreed-upon requirements to reduce the risk of scope creep. I'm experiencing a project right now that I jumped halfway through, where a lot of the definition of the deliverables and the requirements of those deliverables were not well defined, and so we're running into heavy scope creep. And it seems that the project is now 3 projects, but it's still in that one. So I could definitely sympathize or relate to the scenarios of this chapter. And I think it just broke down the thought process in a very simplistic way of how PMs are to approach projects, and what the steps in a high level view are needed to get the project rolling. Ultimately, we need to set the goal, we need to have the deliverables, the requirements, what the assumptions are, the risks. It talked about budgeting or estimates, which I thought was really appealing, and made a lot of sense. So I don't think it was do I agree or disagree? I think it was reality of what PM is, and it was a joy to read. And for my last resource, one standard is no longer standard. So easy in theory, difficult in practice. The blog I read was about the contingency reserve, and it was just interesting to read that in comparison to the simulation. The simulation was a very and this was addressed in the preventing scope and scheduled risks. If there are hard defined scope, budget, and deadline, you're going to run into some pretty large risks. There has to be some leeway in that. And so, I was thinking as the simulation was going, and it's always hard because it's like the contingency reserve piece. I would have been jumping into that week 3 just because I sacrificed budget for scope and for deadline, and budget was just going to increase. From my understanding, I felt that the senior leadership wanted the product out at a certain time, and they wanted a certain product out over budget. And so that for me, reading this and contingency reserve, I would have been plugging into that and been plugging into the management reserve. And the majority of PMs talked about how they still have to ask for approval for the contingency reserve. So in a strict deadline that we were in the simulation, I can see myself getting pretty frustrated with the slowness of what should already have been required or allowed for me to access in the contingency reserve. So it's just something I was thinking back and forth as I was reading the article. So I'll connect these two. So citing specific examples from simulation earlier in this module, discuss any connections you may find that may be drawn, discuss any personal experiences that relate to the reading or blog entries from your past and how these takeaways may relate to your future plans. I think I really touched on key factors from both aspects. But just to summarize, so the simulation in reading the resources, particularly in the preventing scope and scheduling risks, a lot of what was asked of us in deadline, scope, and budget, I'm sure would have been pushed back more or discussed in further detail with the project sponsor, with senior leaders, of how, like, you were going to have to sacrifice something. I'm not going to be able to hit budget if you want scope and deadline. I'm not going to hit deadline if you want budget and scope. So I think those things would have been adjusted, and so the estimates of either goal metric would have been adjusted that way. So I think that summarizes my experience in reading these resources and seeing all the responsibilities in the initiating phase, the initial phase of a project would have been discussed to really circumvent over budget or missing deadline or not hitting the project scope. And then from a personal experience, I've been thrown into the fire in a wonderful way, because I just like it that way, of this PMBA role. I have a leader that is not traditionally a PM, but is entitled as one. She's done PM, she's done projects as a PM, but doesn't have any formal education in regards to that. So, in the earlier project manager I talked about, who's an exceptional PM, has a master's in project management, and she has a PMP cert. So comparing and contrasting, archived files of projects and seeing the differences is black and white. So from my personal standpoint, I'm working this role in real life, reading what I can do in class and other resources to try to mold it and make sure I'm doing it correctly in the workspace, but have a leader that's not in that traditional PM understanding or education. So it's all a mix of things that are happening, but I think I am excited for the next project that actually I start from beginning, that I can rely on my education and what I've learned through these classes and continued education outside of class, and being able to discuss everything in the initial phase and make sure we cover everything in and what our deliverables are and what our requirements of those deliverables are and what the risks are and the change management plan and the status updates and what we'll review and how to review risks as a team. So those are things that I'm adding as we go because those weren't clearly defined at the beginning of the project I'm in right now. But it's been a joy to read these resources, and that's sort of how it's applying to me now and how it will apply to me in the future. But out of all the resources, the Preventing Scope and Scheduling Risk was my favorite read that I want to read again, just because it really helped break down. I was having a hard time understanding deliverable goals, requirements, and like what the differences were. I'm like, those seem the same to me. But it's just, I see a tree from the top down of goals, I guess root up. So goals, deliverables, requirements, and then tasks. So it was really just awesome to see that visual in my head as I was reading through that resource. So thank you for your time, and hopefully this is sufficient in the questions. I know it was not as formal as it possibly could be, but I think this is the best way to express and relay what I learned through this specific module. Appreciate it.